Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Richard not just for the introduction, but for actually leaving Warwick and leaving me running a €9.6 million project. It's usually the person who leaves who gets the gift, but in this case it was me. I do think this is a little bit strange standing here. Australia has for many years produced a raft of first-class China scholars, and in recent years, of course, it's been asset stripping the United Kingdom of many of their first-class China scholars as well. So it seems a bit odd to be here talking about a topic that there is considerable expertise on, not just in Australia, but indeed in this university and in this room. In fact, more expertise than I have. It's a bit like a game show contestant that's lost being shown the prize that they could have had. But, I didn't turn down the opportunity to come, not least because in 7 hours' time the term starts back in Warwick. And so those back in Warwick who are doing the inductions, we salute you and here. The title, perhaps there's three things I should say about the title. There are three things I think that are important in it. First of all is the question mark after low profile no more. Not sure whether we need the question mark, but we'll come back onto that in a second. The second is the insecurity, because there is considerable insecurity in China over resource politics and resource requirements. What might seem like strength and power from the outside often looks like insecurity and weakness from the inside. And the third thing is the plural on worldviews, because this is an increasingly plural place with different opinions, different ideas, which in many ways makes it more interesting to study, but also makes it in some ways more difficult. Oops. So it's called Low Profile No More. This comes from a supposed 24-character phrase, supposedly uttered by Deng Xiaoping. I say supposedly because it's actually got 28 characters in it in most of the iterations, and it's actually quite difficult to find exactly where Deng Xiaoping did say it. But it was an idea that China, going forward in its international relations in the early 1990s, should not try and take a proactive role. It was about hiding brightness and nourishing obscurity, hiding capabilities, bide our time and accomplish some things. In the West, this has often been perceived as a call to really hide China's true intentions, maybe rather deceive people about what China really wanted, and to, in an underhand fashion, maybe make great progress in the inevitable rise to global power. But within China, it's not seen that way at all. It's thought that the West, or certain forces in the West, have tried to misinterpret this for their own political advantage. And the real impetus behind this in the 1990s, after the Tiananmen incident in 1989, was a concern in China that there might be a move towards blocking China from attaining its objectives. That there might be an attempt to create alliances to prevent China's rise. And there was quite good evidence to support the China threat thesis that became quite well known in China in the early 1990s and quite popular. The Olympics vote, you might remember the pictures in 1993 when they thought that Beijing had been given the Olympics and people cheering, and then it turned out that it had gone somewhere not that far from here. There was a vote in the United Nations Human Rights Council in 1995 that condemning China's human rights record that only failed by 2 votes, which I think scared actually the Americans and the Europeans more than it scared the Chinese in some ways, because if it had passed they would have had to have done something about it. Li Denghui went to the United States in 1995, there was the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1996. Well, all of these things seem to suggest that the world was paying particularly close attention to China and that forces might be underway to try and prevent this rise. And then in 1997, the Asian financial crisis, I think, really brought to light the importance to the Chinese leadership of not just security defined as guns, bombs and bullets, but economic security. And then SARS after that refocused the attention on new security issues and the importance of maintaining a national image that was in some way conducive to China's rise, or at the very least didn't lead to opposition to China's rise, became more and more important amongst the Chinese leadership. And in the late 1990s, I think we see 2 things happening. On one side, we see a very populistic move that China can say no generation, we can resist the West, we can say no to them. There was a book in 1996-97 called Behind the Demonization of China, which was very popular and sold out in big numbers in China. But at the same time, an official popular line emphasizing Chinese responsibility. The peaceful rise of China, which was eventually they dropped the rise because the emphasis was on rise rather than is. And this really, I think, is much of the context behind this emphasis on a low profile in international relations, not being too forceful in pushing Chinese preferred international order or China's goals and aims and objectives. But at the same time, around the end of the 1990s, a key change takes place, I think, in that we see a switch from the victim mentality and the centuries of humiliation that had rather underpinned China's view of itself in the world for many years, to one of a great power mentality. If not yet, then an emerging great power mentality. And this actually placed an even greater emphasis, I think, on presenting this preferred national image. Because it's one thing if you're a China that is not particularly strong, not particularly forceful in the global order. If you are becoming a great power, that brings with it certain expectations. And I think what we see emerging in China around the turn of the millennium is how do we deal with this great power status? We are going to become a great power. How do we deal with it in ways, first of all, that get what we want? Secondly, don't lead to opposition to stop us getting what we want. But thirdly, and I think this is important, not entailing the duties and responsibilities that being a great power also carry with it. Because I think if there's one thing that we can say with some clarity, it's that there is a much greater reluctance for global responsibility amongst the Chinese leadership today than there is to assume some levels of global power. Being a global leader carries with it costs, responsibilities, duties that I think there's considerable reluctance to take on. So, how can we try and identify a Chinese worldview that then perhaps we can try and allocate Chinese resource security or insecurity within it? One of the first things I think we have to say is that it's increasingly difficult to know who talks for China. If you discuss international relations, foreign policy in China, with the foreign ministry in China even, they will tell you that the foreign ministry has declined in importance. The traditional historical voices of diplomacy are less important than they used to be. Other agencies, economic agencies, the military, the Coast Guard, state-owned enterprises, local governments are becoming more and more important, and the voices of China are becoming more multiple, more diverse, and more plural, and it's difficult to actually identify a single coherent line. We'll come back onto this later. Secondly, we've seen the growth of what we might call popular voices. Swain tries to make a distinction between authoritative and quasi-authoritative voices of China. This is an example. This was an article that was posted on the Chelsea discussion page. The Chelsea Journal is the official theoretical journal of the CCP. It was an article that talks about the need to build up a strategy basically to counter America's allies, particularly in Asia. It was picked up by the Indian press as being in Chelsea, therefore being the authoritative voice of China, and before you know it, it was being repeated and reprinted and re-edited as an authoritative voice of China. Well, I guess it wouldn't have appeared on the web page if somebody didn't want it to, or if they didn't want it to be on the web page, it could have been taken down pretty quickly. But there's a difference between that and it being the authoritative voice of the Chinese state. And I think one of the issues that we have at the moment is that it's relatively easy to find a voice of China to support whatever view you already have of China. And that's becoming increasingly so. And I think people are able to find the voice of China that they want. And so people can say one moment that China is leading a counteraction against American power and hegemony, but at the same time you can find many statements saying that China wants peace and stability and firm relationships with the United States. So, with that in mind, can we try and identify lines of Chinese worldviews and the importance of keeping a low profile or perhaps abandoning it going forward? And of course these are with big caveats that of course nobody agrees on. Everything you said about China is true, but so is the opposite at the same time. I think the first thing you can say, there is clear dissatisfaction in the PRC with the global order, both the distribution of power within the global order and many of the norms that underpin the global order. Secondly, the overwhelming voice is that it's time for China to take a much more proactive global role, for the low profile to be put aside and a much higher profile and a much more proactive assertion of China's interests. I was told very forcefully by a British China expert in Beijing that public opinion plays no role in Chinese foreign policy. I beg to differ, and I think partly because the state has promoted this public opinion, there is now a relatively strong public opinion that expects a more forceful global role. The idea that China's time has come. The Olympics, the Shenzhou space rocket, the World Expo, the Asian Games, and the different way in which China and the West dealt with or responded to the global financial crisis have all led to an upsurge in a popular belief that the time is right for China to do something more. After the Resolution 1973 on Libya, where China didn't veto the no-fly zone, I'm told that the chemists in China sold out of calcium pills as people bought them and posted them to the foreign ministry to strengthen their backbone. They'd given in, they'd patted into the West. A second argument is that China's growing global presence, which we're going to look at a bit more detail later on, just means you have to have global power projection. You have to have the ability to, for example, get your people out of Libya should the needs arise. You have to have the ability to deal with piracy off Somalia. As you have greater economic interests across the world, you need to promote diplomatic and other political initiatives that are commensurate with that spread of power and influence. A third argument is it's simply not in China's best interest to let the West, the Americans, Europe, to lead on global issues, because they will take the world in places that China doesn't want to go. A fourth, and this came out a bit during the Libya thing as well, there are a group of what we might call liberal internationalists in China who think it's simply the right thing to do. That as a great power you can't just sit back and not take responsibility. That you do have to do something, you do have to play a role. Wang Yizhou, who I think is probably the foremost Chinese international politics scholar of our time, produced a fantastic book a couple of years ago called Creative Involvement, saying that China had to find ways of getting involved, and in fact already had found ways of getting involved in other countries, North Korea, Burma, Libya, Somalia, to an extent Sudan, in ways that were commensurate with a great power, but which did not repeat the mistakes of the previous colonial Western great powers. And I think that what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, and not least because of the global financial crisis, is an increasing confidence in many areas to push forward with these ideas, to push forward Chinese agendas, to promote different ideas. Let me give you a brief example. We did a report at Chatham House earlier this year on China and the international human rights regime. And one of the things we were focused on was the way in which China redefines human rights. Says, we believe in human rights, we define human rights in this way. And the same is true with human security. I did a paper on Chinese conceptions of human security, and it's exactly the same. We believe in human security, and we mean this by it. Whereas perhaps in the past it's always been defensive, we believe this by it, so don't criticise us. We are finding evidence that now in Geneva that the Chinese delegates are trying to push forward their definitions and their understandings as a working basis for discussions, not just a defensive measure, but a much more proactive measure going forward. Wang Yizhou at Beijing University actually says that the global financial crisis led to a power shift, or at least a weakening of the West, which actually took China's leaders by surprise and placed them in a position of greater power than they'd expected to be in. And so the response to things that were being said by Chinese leaders actually took them by surprise. Now, having said that, it's actually quite difficult to identify a clear, coherent alternative. It's clear what China is opposed to, but what the Chinese alternative might be is difficult to pin down. A bigger say for developing countries, and a bigger say for China. The democratization of global governance organisations, though not perhaps the Security Council, where China, of course, has a rather asymmetric element of power. The re-emphasis of sovereignty in the United Nations, and what I call a non-normative normative position. And that is that the Chinese normative position is there should be no normative position in international relations. So by pursuing a non-normative normative position, that I think becomes a normative position and the stance for China's international relations going forward. We have seen recently an attempt, I think, to try and articulate this, the China dream. Yang Jiechi is the State Councillor for Foreign Affairs, who's not actually even on the Politburo, so he's not even in the top 28 of the Chinese hierarchy, which is quite interesting when you think about the comparative people standard. I think this is largely actually about reinforcing the credentials of Xi Jinping as leader. There's been a real attempt, I think, to show Xi Jinping as the great power. Communist Xi Jinping's comprehensive, profound and exquisite description of the China dream. But then when you try and get into it in a bit more detail, it's quite difficult to pin down. It seems to be about the need to take greater power with the United States, but not abandoning developing states. The great renewal of the Chinese nation, there's a key element of national rejuvenation within here. But he does actually say continuation of development and the important thinking of peaceful development, so that doesn't sound particularly new. And then attempts by certain international forces at distorting and smearing the Chinese dream. So again, we have this common theme that seems to run through, that the West is trying to demonize China and turn China around on its head. But there's great emphasis played throughout this that even that China might have an alternative vision, difficult to pin down, there doesn't appear to be any great desire to promote revolutionary change of the system rather than try and reform it from within. And in fact, the question mark remains at the beginning of this paper, because there are still quite loud voices within China saying that China shouldn't abandon keeping a low profile. And in fact, keeping a low profile is the best way going forward. Liu Yiping from KICA, which is the Security Ministry's think tank, says that, look, we've still got 150 million people living in poverty. How can we, it's ludicrous to think that we can be a global leader. Our responsibility has to be to ourselves and our own people and our own development for the time being. We are a poor state. There's another discourse that says that the West is actually trying to trap China into a G2 mentality, to flatter it into thinking like a great power, so it will take on more of the costs and responsibilities, for example, in terms of environmental governance. And there is a clear dual identity, really, of China as emerging great power, but also of China as poor developing state. And I'll come back to this in the conclusion and perhaps try and take that split personality and split it even further into different dimensions. But perhaps the clearest reason why people say that China should try and keep a low profile is that we go back to the China threat theory, or the China threat hypothesis, which we should all try and say at 7 o'clock drinks tonight, let's see if we can get it right, and say that it's not in China's best interest. I read a very interesting article. It said that the more we say about what we want, the more people are likely to ally to stop us getting it. And this is from the People's Daily Report, I think it was recently. It went through a number of the key investment projects that Chinese companies had tried to obtain overseas, and where they've been blocked out of political concern of the security interests, primarily excuse me, in the United States, but also actually the last one in there, because it was in Australia as well. It's just in that Huawei, however, are welcome to do business in the City of London and have done deals with Boris Johnson and the Mayor of London, and so we apparently have no real considerations as long as the investment money is there. So there is this fear in China that the world is there to block China's interests. And if we move the talk onto energy, we can perhaps begin to see some of the reasons why the West is becoming fearful. First of all, we see a rapid growth in overseas oil development. We see a resource development plan. We see a number of projects, state-owned companies taking the lead. Export-Import Bank as the state credit agency. Active energy diplomacy by the president to try and get commercial contracts. An expansion into land leases and purchases, one of which led to a coup in Madagascar. It's not China, it's South Korea that has done all of these things. And yet, you very rarely hear the agenda of South Korea threatening the global energy or resource market, or threatening the global liberal order. And sometimes I think we become so focused in on China that we forget that there are other countries out there doing different things. I mean, this looks like the sort of thing that China has been criticised about, apart from the coup, which, as far as I'm aware, China has not yet generated in Africa. But it's not. And the reason for this, of course, is that there is something about China. If the threat to the West in the first half of the 20th century was the yellow peril of the Asian alternative, and in the second half of the 20th century it was the red peril of the communist alternative, China is the orange peril of the 21st century. It is the combination of both the Asian and communist alternative. It threatens not just resources, but the global liberal order. There is this discourse that China could set scores of developing nations away from the path of liberal democracy, creating a community of countries that reject Western views of human rights and accepted standards of national government. So it's not just about contracts, state intervention, state banks. It's about this understanding of what China is or might be. And these are the major fears that have shaped, I think, many Western observations of China's energy insecurity, which in turn then feed in to Chinese conceptions of insecurity when it comes to global resources. There's the price and distribution of global resources. It's not just that China's a new player, but it's a predatory market player with state companies supported by the state. There was an article in one of the British newspapers that noted that fence posts had increased vastly in price because of increased demand from China. And so this was now affecting the lives of the most middle class English occupations. The idea that China might be becoming a system shaper, that it's shoring up rogue states, that it's changing patterns of power, particularly after the global financial crisis, and in some observations, possibly even leading to war and instability. And those of you who have been to Sentosa and stood and looked outwards, like I have, rather than inwards, which is probably a better view, and watching all the ships carrying the oil one way, and then the goods back to Europe the other way, will know what we mean. This is, of course, the big agenda. The concern that not because of, or not necessarily just because of what's under the water, but what passes through the water in Southeast Asia is going to be the cause of conflict, and possibly the cause of conflict sometime soon. Excuse me. Which lays another dimension to this concern about the consequences of China's dotted red lines. That's of course not China's dotted red lines, but you can see where the territorial claims go. What's interesting is that if you speak to scholars in China about this, rather than place the emphasis on China's assertive foreign policy, they'll say, why are we being encircled by the West? And this is partly a result of where China gets most of its supplies from, as it's become a net importer, first of all, of oil. We see an attempt to try and diversify the supplies from 1993, but we still end up with a lot of the oil that goes into China going through the Straits of Malacca. That bottom figure there is just to show the extent of Chinese imports, but also to show if you add on the imports that are going to Japan, you can work out where they're going geographically as well, given where they're coming from too. So, that is the external conceptions of China and the insecurity that China creates. Yet within China, there is a strong feeling of insecurity about China's position related to resources. This is from a paper that I co-wrote with Jia Daojun at Beijing University, and by co-wrote I mean he wrote this bit. That's why his name is on the top of there. And he tries to make a distinction between having sufficient supplies but feeling secure and feeling energy secure. So we have the first period where there's not any supplies but no feelings of security because you're concerned about war with the United States. In phase 2, there's a feeling that it's sufficient, but you don't feel secure. And in the third front, industrialisation, we have a huge shift of resources to survive the coming war with either the United States or the Soviet Union, or possibly both, leading to insecurity, though you had sufficiency. In phase 3, sufficiency declines, but it's not so much of a problem because China feels quite secure about its place in the global order. It becomes a net importer of oil in 93 and petroleum in 96, but it's okay. It doesn't see the world as being an insecure place in the pursuit of energy politics. Phase 4, not sufficient but not insecure, but this is the beginning of the China's threat thesis that we spoke about before, and oil demand beginning to increase. And this is the situation that we get into now in phase 5, where China has not got sufficient resources and growing concerns as well about security. There is a fear about China's dependence on the global economy, particularly after the Asian financial crisis of 1997. This led to great feelings of economic insecurity, a growing conceptions of energy insecurity, not least driven by that huge increase in the price of Brent oil in 1999 to 2000, in a period where Chinese oil imports increased quite rapidly. And it's not rocket science to see why this led to growing feelings of insecurity. Old concerns about Africa and the Middle East, that political conflicts and war might reduce supplies, concerns about the dollar peg and the price of oil being the dollar, and then the idea that China was a latecomer into global oil markets that were dominated by the United States and the West. This was a key concern. As a sort of an aside, Dao Jiang also points out that actually many of China's energy insecurity issues are domestic in nature. Coal, this is a rather complex slide. If everything goes wrong, this will be amazed actually. There we go. Coal is still the most important source of energy in China. There you have the figure up to 2010. And you can see that coal is by far the major resource that is used. Clever? So far. And there it is put in a slightly different way. Where you can see that coal dominates at about 70% with oil at about 20%. So it's massively, heavily coal dependent. Those of you who have been to Chinese major cities over the last winter will have seen the consequences of some of this as the little coal briquette things burnt in China's cities help contribute to the worst pollution I've ever seen in 30 years of visiting China over last year. It's become a net importer of coal, partly because it can't get the coal from where it is to where it's needed because of transport bottlenecks, but also because some of the quality isn't very good. But efficiency and usage it's been going down. Let's try and see if this does work. Great, it does work. So we see that the blue line is going down, so that's the thousands per constant dollar of production. It went up again after the financial crisis, as China pumped loads of money into investment, and it's beginning to come back down again. But its point being that there's a long way that China can go in terms of changing its dependence on a certain type of oil. Its refining capacity means that it can't use much of the oil, for example, that it owns in Venezuela. And in fact, apparently it can't even ship it back because of the nature. Nuclear power and clean power are not that strong. And now there is a green agenda, a massive green agenda, a massive expansion of, for example, solar panels. Massive subsidies to solar panel producers to the extent that the leading producer of solar panels actually went bankrupt when there was a massive expansion of solar power production. One of the interesting ways the Chinese economy actually works. But importantly, and I am going to go back to my PhD thesis of the importance of provincial governments pursuing their own developmental strategies. I did a paper for the Aluminium Extruders Association conference in Britain a couple of years ago. Yes, there is one. Where one of the key things we pointed to that every local authority wants its own smelter. Massively energy inefficient, but everybody wants one. So if you rationalise it out, a lot can be done. So that's an aside to point to the importance of actually getting things sorted out domestically, but going global is clearly an important point. Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest this is the most powerful roundabout in the entire world. On this bottom right-hand side is the Chinese Foreign Ministry. That, though, isn't necessarily the powerful bit. Top left, China National Offshore Oil Corporation office building. Top right, Sinopec, China Petrochemicals. I suggest to you that the north part of this roundabout in Chang'an might be in fact the most important and powerful roundabout in the entire world. If you carried on down here, there used to be a shop that used to sell Chinese military paraphernalia, but it's now been closed down, which is a bit unfortunate, although it saves me money each time I go to China. China's major overseas oil deals began, well, quite a long time back. They have been the subject of considerable concern. This is from the Center for American Progress, which points to some of the major examples. The first one was in 1993. They've been going on and on. I fortunately had a research student go through things with me over the summer, and she presented a huge list to me that was just too big to put down of the deals that China signed since 2011. And they're not always specifically energy deals. So, for example, China is helping build a railway in Afghanistan, but in return is getting some of the payments back in coal. So that's not explicitly an energy investment, but it's clearly an investment that has energy consequences. It is a state-led project to some extent. Whether it's to dominate global energy supply is another issue. I'm not so sure. This is the Angolan president, José Eduardo dos Santos, Angola being the key African source of oil to China. There is, in addition to these contracts that have been signed, what I would refer to as a process as occidentalism. I think there's an attempt to create an idea of China as a different type of great power, not by creating necessarily an image of China, but by creating an image of the West as great power, and then saying, and we're not that. And this then hopefully leads to friendly relationships with developing states and less concern about dealing with China than might otherwise be the case. But, although the state is clearly heavily involved, we need to be careful not to think of it as being just a single coherent state project. Now, at this point, I admit to failure. I had a picture of Xi Jinping, and I had a picture of the Bond villain Blofeld stroking a cat, and I tried to merge them together to give an image of the Chinese state as a Bond villain, and I couldn't do it. So it would have been there now, so imagine what it might have looked like. And that, I think, is often the idea that we have of these activities, but we have to be very careful. There are lots of new actors. There are private Chinese energy operators, local companies. If you, particularly in the rest of Asia, but not just in Asia, you will find that it's the local companies, often local government state companies, but local companies that are going out and undertaking much of China's go global strategy. Chinese state-owned enterprises are competing with each other, at home to a lesser extent, but also in overseas markets. In-depth research by Downs and Debbie Broadcom and others show that once the companies are there, they're actually taking operational autonomy. They might rely on the support of the state to get where they want to be, but once they're there, they operate as companies in search of profits, not in support of a coherent single Chinese state projects. Many energy-related projects don't have direct energy consequences for the Chinese state, but actually either have direct financial consequences, for the example in Malawi, where they upgrade the electricity capacity, and the Chinese company obviously makes a profit, or simply produce for the global markets. It's not clear, partly because of China's rather obscure relationship with the International Energy Agency, how much of Chinese oil that it owes overseas actually goes back to China. But it's probably about a third is all that goes back to China, with the rest of it being sold into global markets. So what we've got is Chinese companies supported by the state, with preferential treatment by state banks, then acting like commercial actors overseas, rather than acting like agents of the Chinese state supporting a coherent project. According to the International Energy Agency, almost all the energy production Chinese NOCs have in the Americas was sold locally instead of being shipped back to China. Now this might change. Refining capacity is increasing. Chinese tankers are being developed so that they can actually get the stuff back. But for the time being, I think we can come to some conclusions, and I confess here that the conclusions, this paper sort of peters out towards the end. Wasn't quite sure how to finish it off. I think what we can say is, yes, there really is a state project with goals, intentions and support. Yes, there really is an attempt to construct a national image as a different type of great power to aid a long-term strategy. Yes, the Chinese financial structure does help Chinese energy interests overseas. But that doesn't mean that all that is done by all people or companies associated with China should be considered to be part of this clear, coherent state project. The sad, inconvenient truth is that it's more complicated than that. Making a buck, making a quick buck, making a buck when it's increasingly difficult to make that buck back in China is part of these considerations. There are, I think, relatively strong arguments to say that China's search for energy security suggests a liberal energy peace. I'm not going to go through all of those things. That back to my friend Zhao Jung, who says one of the great ironies is that the American Navy keeps the Strait of Hormuz clear for oil to pass to China, so that Chinese companies can produce cheap crap that is then sold in Walmart. and this is the sort of liberal energy peace that he's talking about. And there are strong arguments for that, but the problem is politics gets in the way. When energy and resources are left to the technical specialists, we see lots of cooperation, lots of projects to work together. But it's when politics gets in the way and it comes back into the realms of particularly high politics that things begin to go wrong. Perceptions of insecurity remain very strong. And I've already said that there's this strong feeling that the United States in particular is surrounding China. When a report was produced 2 years ago now about Chinese energy cooperation in the future with different countries, I'm told that there was no chapter on energy cooperation with the United States. And yet the United States is the country that China has the most formal energy cooperative projects signed with. Where does this leave us with China's worldview? I started it off earlier on by saying that there was this split personality, and I was going to split it a bit further. Well, it comes from an article in China's Contemporary International Relations by Wei Zhongmei and Fu Yu. And they argue that China has 4 simultaneous identities. And this influences the way that China acts, and it depends really on the partner and the context. So the first is China sees itself as a developing country, in common with other developing countries, and this influences the way it acts, for example, in FOCAP reform and China-Africa cooperation. Second, though, it sees itself as a rising power, and this conditions the way that it acts with other rising powers, and we see this manifest, for example, in the BRICS, which I would call an alliance of the dissatisfied. And here we have a forum where people dissatisfied with the global order get to espouse their dissatisfaction, not always necessarily an alternative. Thirdly, China is a global power. The very fact that it's on the United Nations Security Council gives it that position as a global power, and this shapes the way that it acts in those great power environments. Fourth, whether some people in China like it or not, China is part of a G2. And some areas, sometimes, China is part of a G2, and this does increasingly condition the way that China sees itself as having to interact with the United States. I would add a fifth, that China sees itself as a regional power, and I think that it's in the region that we really might see. I think a lot of people will look at the region and see how China acts as a real regional power, as some sort of indicator of how it's going to act as an even more powerful global agent in the future. And that brings me back to the final thing, so how do we come back to this question? I think China is a dissatisfied, responsible great power. It's dissatisfied with the global order. It wants to change it. It wants to shape it, but it doesn't want to do it in ways that have costs for China. And one of these costs would be destabilising the existing order. So I think for the time being we can see China as a dissatisfied, responsible great power. But we're also, I think, going to continue to see vacillations in policy depending on who China is dealing with. And this makes things very difficult to predict. So I think at that point I'll just stop. And as Tim Gray, my tutor in my first year, always used to say at the end of each lecture, thanks for listening, if you have.
We still have a bit of time for some questions. We have Melissa on this side and Alanga on this side with the microphone. So if you just raise your hand, I'll be able to direct them to you. We have Sam at the back there. Maybe we'll take two more and then...
Well, thank you very much, Shaun, for your wonderful presentation. I have a few concerns with the conclusions. Is that the view which every great power holds? The UK, the US, China, Russia, and France. They all see themselves as dissatisfied, responsible great powers. So what difference does it make with China?
Maybe we'll just take one more question.
Yeah, okay.
Melissa, do you want to... Jeff, yeah, thank you. Is it working?
There we go. Yeah, that's it. Shaun, thanks very much. I'd just like to pick up on the point you tried to make about oil companies and Chinese resource companies having operational autonomy overseas, and particularly the arguments that Downs and Broughton make to that effect. It certainly is the case, I think, that once they get there, they do become very operationally autonomous and very profit-oriented. But one of the underlying conditions that allow them to make profit is that they're getting massively subsidised loans, and not just loans from state banks, but massively subsidised, often negative real interest rate loans, which is why they can turn a profit. And the kind of assets they've bought overseas, most Western oil companies will say, the reason that China's in Africa is all the African assets are comparatively non-competitive, and we've got the rest, and so they're just buying what's left kind of on the market. To what extent is the operational autonomy of the company, whether it's state-owned or private, really relevant in a situation where the state council that approves these loans, if they're over $200 million US, can simply say, we're going to take the loans away, and then the profitability collapses overnight? Doesn't that give the state a significant veto player role over these companies, that you can be operationally autonomous until the point you upset someone and then the money's gone?
Can I start with the second one first, because I just agree with you, so it's easier to agree with you, but I call it contingent capitalism. So capitalism in China is fine, but it's contingent on it, and in some ways echoing or at least not opposing the overall interests of the state. I think it's fair to say that the bigger companies are increasingly looking to overseas managers and expertise and even finance in some cases for to inform what they're doing. But it's a good point well made. My point would be that they're not necessarily, when they're overseas, pursuing an coherent project to get all the resources and take them home. They're there to make money, but the fact that they're making money because the state is massively supporting them, and as you say, can pull the plug. It's a form of contingent capitalism that we also see within China domestically as well, that the capitalist system is allowed to work as long as it doesn't bump into the interests of the state system. But I think the point's well made. I think this dissatisfaction it's a good point, but it's different in how many ways? I think two ways. I think in lots of ways, I can't speak for the United Kingdom as much as I would want to sometimes, but there is dissatisfaction with the global order in Britain because of the inability of the global liberal order to sort of push itself through in the face of these recalcitrant states like Russia and China that aren't playing ball. I think the slight difference is that there is a reluctance in China with the global liberal order. And what we see, and perhaps this is at the heart of what you were getting at, is that we see these dissatisfactions coming into contact with each other in a number of different ways, and we've seen it perhaps most clearly over the last year or so over Syria. But I think the difference is, on the one side, a reluctance that the preferred liberal order isn't being allowed to function, versus a dissatisfaction with the very basics of that liberal order. So I do think it's a different form of dissatisfaction, but your point was well made.
Yep. Lee? We got anybody else?
Lee doesn't need a microphone.
And Ben.
Thanks. Shaun, you mentioned early on about there are multiple Chinese voices because the foreign ministry has declined in importance and other agencies have risen. And you didn't really return very much to that point. Now it seems, on the South China Sea in particular, that seems really relevant, the so-called 9 dragons that are steering the sea. And that seems to be the main risk, that these confrontations, these accidental ships bashing against each other and so on, it's police, it's coast guard, it's provincial agencies and so on. Now, I read somewhere recently that they've tried to unify 5 of these agencies into one. So how much of a risk do you think these plural agencies are in terms of potentially creating accidental conflict or dragging the state into confrontations? And do you think that the Chinese central government is alert to this and is starting to take a more sort of centralising role?
Anyone else? Is it working?
Shaun, I want to ask about your conclusion about China being a responsible dissatisfied group. My understanding of the way that term tends to be used, if we think of the Bob Zellick kind of responsible stakeholder idea, is a China that actually invests in global public goods to some extent. But your talk, and many others that I've heard, your talk really, I think, was a China that where it can will free ride. It'll free ride on the American 7th Fleet and the others. It'll free ride by simply not willing to make the monetary investments that are sometimes required. You know, it's very expensive if you want to be a responsible great power. You have to actually put in. So it seems to me your conclusion is somewhat at odds with the very evidence that you trotted out for us in your talk. Maybe you can explain.
Okay. Well, if I go backwards from that, I don't think there's a contradiction actually, because I didn't use stakeholder. It's dissatisfied, but it's going to exercise and try and articulate this dissatisfaction responsibly, which is not the same as being a stakeholder within the system. It's saying we're not going to overthrow the system through irresponsible action. We're going to push for reform and change from within, and quite rightly, as you say, free riding as we go along. So it's specifically and deliberately not a Zellick-esque responsible stakeholder within the system. So if there is an apparent contradiction there, I think it's a contradiction in the way that we've been using that final term. They don't want to take the responsibility. They want to change things, but they don't want to change things in ways which will destabilise, and let's face it, destabilise a global order which has done China quite well over recent years. You know, it ain't been bad for the Chinese to participate in this global capitalist system over the last 20 years. But that's what I mean by it, by wanting to change it, not wanting to take responsibility, but not wanting to change it in ways that upset it too dramatically. So change where possible, peacefully from within, rather than overthrow it, because to overthrow it is dangerous. Yes, they are trying to centralise, they're very much aware of this. The South China Sea is one manifestation of this, and quite rightly, as you say, they're now trying to get the coast guards all into one unit, which will still leave the Hainan provincial government as a sort of independent actor, then the Coast Guard, and then the PLA Navy, and then the oil companies, and so on and so forth. So there is still possibility of accidents there, or things happening, and you know, the possibility, I would have thought, of some military engagement, shall we put it that way, confrontation in the South China Sea, I would have thought remains quite high over the next few years. But that's only one element of the different voices. So they're trying to resolve that potential, specifically in the South China Sea. But it operates in lots of other areas as well. So I mean, if you go to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and you talk to the economic specialists there, you'll get this story about economic fragility and concern about the way things are going. But then you talk to some international relations scholars and you get the, yeah, we're a global power now, the time is right. And so it works on different levels. And I do think you've got to be careful that you don't just find the voice you want to hear, because it's so easy to go to China and find the voice that you want to hear that confirms what you want to say. And I get loads of feeds on a daily basis from China and from observations of China. And I can tell you any story about the Chinese economy that I wanted to tell you on any day. From it collapsing tomorrow, or perhaps even by now, to global superpower status by this time tomorrow afternoon. So there are these diverse voices, but it really is a very interesting place. I've not come across a country, I think, where there's so much discussion about what sort of state China could become, but perhaps more importantly, should become. So there's the operational, practical side of it that you're talking about, where they are trying to do something. But at the same time, there's a flourishing of these. Now, we need to be careful that this space for these discussions can contract as well as expand. And one of the sad things that happened after Libya was that it contracted quite significantly. Because those voices who had pushed for China to take a more responsible, if I use it again, position over Libya, found themselves with little space to operate in after that turn from a no-fly zone into a regime change. So it works in different ways. But in the specifics of the South China Sea, yes, they are trying to do something. Yes, they're aware, but the potential for an accident, I'm afraid, still exists.
Gentleman over there. And Silke.
John, this is one of the reasons why China is not challenging a global order, despite being disillusioned and dissatisfied, is because there is no alternative version.
Yeah, hi, my name is Silke Thoma. I'm here at the Asia Research Centre and I'm working on a future of the WTO project together with Anne Capling. Anne and I were just in Beijing last week to do interviews there with trade policy communities and so forth. And we heard a lot about the Shanghai Free Trade Zone that was just announced last week. Now, we were trying to understand what it actually was and found a lot of our interviewers quite puzzled. They didn't, even within MOFCOM or whatever, they were not so sure. But what I got from the Chinese media, or what we got, was that it's a kind of a zone in Shanghai that is perhaps an experiment with financial deregulation, so attracting foreign investment and losing capital controls. I read something even about kind of offshore facilities and so forth. So I was just wondering what your perspective on that free trade zone is. Is it a kind of first step towards integrating China into the financial markets, or how does it fit into the broader perspective that you've given us?
There is no alternative. Well, I think there is a feeling that there is a slightly different alternative, but it's perhaps not as radical as it's put forward. I mean, this is why I come back to, if you look for what the China model is, I think you would find it very difficult to say what it is. But what you can say is what it's not. And I think this is the message that is put forward in terms of the China promotion of the China model. It's not Big Bang liberalisation. It's not linking politics with economic liberalisation. It's not this. And a lot of the China emphasis on the China model is, well, it's not. Personally, I think you can actually go back to Henry Clay, Alexander Hamilton, and the American system of the 1830s and find much of what the China model is, what the American system was. And it's the same in terms of the promotion of a global order. It's not really what the global order will be, it's what it's not going to be. And what it's not is it's not going to be the promotion of a normative liberal political conditionalities. It's not going to be infringing on sovereignty. So I don't know whether that does ultimately create an alternative global order, or we're back to the one where that you say where it's not. But there are some people in Beijing, particularly at Tsinghua University, who are experimenting with different conceptions of a Chinese-inspired understanding of morality, civilization, international relations. Now, the question is, that I'm not quite sure, is whether this is an international relations, an international order for China, or an international order for the world. Because if it could be that it's just an international order for China, which means you would then have to have a Malaysian system of global order that is based on Malaysian history, and a Gambian system based on Gambian history. So each country would develop its own conception of world order, or whether it's something that can be transferable. I think I'm probably inclined to agree with you at the bottom, at the end of it, though. The zone, well, I think it is exactly that. It's, you know, let's try and find a way of experimenting with things that we think we want to experiment in. If you go back and look at the World Bank report that came out 2012 or 2011 that was talking about financial reform, there's a clear recognition of a need for some form of financial reform, but there's strong, powerful vested interests within the Chinese state system who don't want it. And there are also dangers from doing it to the financial system if it's bought in lock, stock and barrel. And it's just the typical traditional way of doing things in China is to go and try and experiment. But you experiment in somewhere where it's going to work. You don't go to the most backward agricultural rural part of China to experiment in the sort of finance. You give it the best chance of working so that then you can stand back and say, it works. Therefore, we need to try and now spread it into the rest of the system. And it's a way of getting political leverage, I think, over those parts of the political apparatus who don't really want to see it. So let's try and see if it works. We'll see what works over here. We don't make it too clear. So you make it too clear, then people can oppose it. So you keep it a little bit vague, and we'll see what happens, and then we'll try and roll this, and then when it works, we'll say, we'll try and spread this out now. We'll expand the zone. So I suspect some people don't know. I suspect some people do know and don't want to stay.
Right. Jing Dongyuan, University of Sydney. Shaun, I just want to ask you two related questions. One is, we talk about the actors of Nine Dragons and Small Dragons Stirring the Sea. What about the energy faction as an actor in influencing China's energy security policy? Because if you look at the 1960s and 70s, you have very powerful people like Chile, Kamshun, now most recently, obviously, Golden Khan. And we see recently also a lot of people just down purged because of corruption and all that. Clearly, they have some, by themselves and their hatred in the hierarchy of the Chinese power structure. So that's one. The other is how China's, say, Security Council resolution decision, vote, not vote, absentee, how much is that influenced by China's interest in energy security resources, say, with regard to Iran, Iran, Libya,
Okay. I mean, the first question I made is yes. I mean, I think what's happened is that the idea of there being a single faction, I think, is something that we can increasingly question. The petroleum faction, or whatever you want to call it, from the early 1970s was a very clear interest group. I think the energy industries have been an interest, but as I understand it now, with the different state-owned enterprises in the same industry, often fighting for contracts, the idea of them as a single, I think, interest group is perhaps losing a little bit of purchase, but it's an important point to make. Second one, I think, is really fascinating. This was something we tried to explore in the Chatham House report. And it was suggested to us, I better be careful how I say this, by somebody. China's position on Sudan was heavily influenced by the energy companies. China's position on Libya, not so much by the energy companies, but by broader conceptions of Chinese economic interests in Libya. And in Sudan, as they put it, in Syria, as they put it, we don't have significant economic interests, so we can take a more purely ideological position over Syria. Which means that in Sudan you had specific interests, Libya you had economic interests that you want to protect, and in Syria they didn't, so they could abstain. However, what is amazing over Libya is not that China didn't veto Resolution 1973. It actually voted in favour of Resolution 1970 that referred Libya to the International Criminal Court. Now this is astonishing for two reasons. One, it's the first time it's ever happened. Two, China doesn't recognise the International Criminal Court. And it actually voted in favour of something they didn't agree to. It caused quite a lot of consternation, as I've already referred to, back in China, as I'm sure you're aware. As we were led to believe, the Chinese delegation in New York wanted to abstain from the big vote over Syria, but were told directly from Beijing that they had to veto. So I think we can see that where energy, and this is very interesting, because I'll throw out a hypothesis that the more Chinese economic interests spread across the world, the more China has economic interests in places like Syria, the more China sees what's happened in Libya, and now Chinese companies, by all accounts, not getting contracts in Libya because they were seen to have taken the wrong side, the possibility of China becoming more like a normal state in international relations perhaps appears as well.
I just abuse my position as chair here. To use the cliche. My question relates to, you put forward a few hypotheses. Again, it's another word that I don't think we'll be able to say about 7, but I just said it now. What set of circumstances, what factors in your view might actually lead to conflict as opposed to this liberal energy piece that you were describing before?
I think actually it comes back to what Lee was always talking about before, and the South China Sea, and the potential for a prod and a push to test the limits of America's intent to support its allies within the region, perhaps. First of all, the Philippines could escalate into things that people don't want to escalate into. I think it's very interesting that if you talk to people in China who are quite liberal on politics, almost very neoliberal at times over economics, and then start talking about territory, there's bottom lines there. It's very difficult to even have a debate over this. The belief that the territory is quite simply China's and nobody else should be getting involved in it. And what comes back to one of the things I hinted at, but perhaps didn't expand on, this idea after the global financial crisis that China now can defend its core interests. China might not be powerful enough yet to shape the way perhaps that the United States acts, but it can defend itself from these things. And with territory, and whether the South China Sea is part of China's core interests is, at times it looks like it's not, at times it looks like it is, but certainly I think creates a possibility for something to happen there that ultimately nobody really wants through prodding and pushing. Because this comes back to my point about China as a region. I think if there's one thing that China really thinks that the Chinese government thinks that it can achieve is, if not dominating the Asian region, at least stopping the United States and Japan from dominating that region and enforcing China's core interests within the regions. That, I think, is ultimately, that's where the danger lies. There was an article in one of the newspapers last week, I don't know whether people saw this, it was the 6 wars that China must fight by 2050. Did anybody see this? Oh, maybe they did, so I don't remember. Right? So it was Taiwan, the Diaoyutai and the Ryukyus, which is Okinawa, obviously. Outer Mongolia, southern Tibet with India. The Spratlys, obviously,